As we left the 3C last time, that was with the camera basically fully functioning as long as you only wanted to use the faster speeds, rangefinder nice and clear and bright, correctly adjusted, and everything else in a good state. But the shutter, we certainly need to deal with the shutter. So first off, we'll open it up from the front. So I'm going to remove the lens, just rotate the bayonet, front element just bayonets in. You've got to be very careful with this when you put it back that you line up the red dot and the red dot, because otherwise life doesn't go well. Right, so let's have a look at this. Set to 1 second, watch the blades. They're a bit sluggish to come back, and you might have also noticed that there was an obvious patch of oil there where the blades overlapped. It's not even going to come together now. You can see the patch of oil on that blade there. And where the blades overlap, that oil just acts, it just sticks things together like glue, basically. So, faced with a problem like that, what can you do? Well, in the ideal world, of course, the shutter will be stripped right down, completely cleaned, all the oil and grease and contaminants removed, and reassembled using appropriate lubrication where required, adjusted, and it'll be just like a new one again. Are there any cheats? You can spend a lot of time swabbing the shutter blades with some naphtha, cigarette lighter fluid or similar, and you may get a reasonable result. You may make the problem a lot worse. I'm not going to bother with that. I'm just going to get into it. So we'll open it up and have a look, see if there's anything else in there slowing that shutter down. I'll start by removing the lock screw, visible right there. That screw is very small. It also only has a couple of threads. I'll just drop that on my bench and I'll have to find it now before I go ahead any further. Otherwise it'll get away and I'll never see it again. As you see, I found that screw. It was doing its best to get away, but not today. So back to the camera. I'll zoom out a bit. So the retaining ring, with the lock screw undone, the retaining ring simply unscrews. And here I'm using a toothpick to rotate that. Best practice to do something like that. Bamboo skewer will work. A plastic tool would work. If you start pushing that round with the tip of your tweezers or a screwdriver, chances are you'll end up scarring it, making it look ugly. Of course no one will know but you, but you won't like it. So there's our retaining ring from the front. Now the front ring here, this piece, this is the bayonet mount for the front lens component, and these little indentations on the back, they form the click stops for our shutter speeds. This ring here is the repeater, if you like. That brings our aperture settings up to the top of the shutter where you can easily read them. So I'm going to take off this front ring here. This central piece here, I'm just removing that. Alright, that couples to the diaphragm setting down here, and I can tell immediately as I run my finger across that's stiff. That tells me that the blades are gooey with oil. But basically that connects that piece up to it, and that piece in turn couples to the aperture settings that you get at the top of the shutter. And this is basically the pretty piece that couples to our shutter speed settings. And here's the shutter itself. This piece on the front, that plate's the shutter speed settings cam plate. And basically it sets the position of the retard gear train up, the arm on the retard gear train. And that determines how far that retard gear train has to swing for the various speeds. So let's have that plate off. All this is a little bit sort of sticky and with old grease and stuff. It's not in a bad shape. And we can see into the inside of the shutter itself here and all the various components. This piece here is the cocking ring that cocks the shutter. The film advance mechanism basically couples to this point here, and it can push that ring around. And as that ring rotates, it rotates this little pinion here, which cocks the main spring for the shutter, and also latches this other mechanism here, which will lock the shutter in the cocked position. Here is the shutter release, and this little piece here acts to block the action of the shutter release unless the shutter is cocked. When the shutter is cocked, this arm can swing out of the way, and I'll see if I can achieve that. I'll put the retaining ring back on the front, to keep the cocking ring in place. And I'll swing the film advance, and you'll see that as I swing the film advance, it cocks the shutter. This cocking ring doesn't come back to the rest position, it stays a little bit further advanced in the start position, and it means that the tab here is now clear of the shutter release, and you can depress the shutter release. And basically that mechanism's there to stop you being able to press the shutter release if the shutter is not cocked. Because when you press the shutter release, you also release the film advance lever, which would allow you to wind on. And by having that feature in the shutter, it means that you're not likely to press the shutter release again and be able to wind on again, thinking that you've got a photo when you've got nothing at all because the shutter hadn't been cocked. Right, so let's get into this. I think we'll dismantle some of this from the front. I'm going to remove the shutter completely, which is what I normally do first of all when I'm servicing a shutter, and take it all to bits. But some of the dismantling can be done from the front here just as easily. So let's start with the cocking ring. Remove that. It's got a little spring on it here which swings the cocking ring back into position, and that spring hooks over a post down here. Now that little lever that fell in there this one, that was the lever we were talking about before. This is the pinion that cocks the film advance, and this shutter's in the cocked position at the moment. We'll release that. You can see it's a bit reluctant to move. Okay, so this here is our retard gear train. If the shutter's in the cocked position, we can remove that from the camera quite easily. So I'll just set this. It's not staying latched. What have I done? Yeah, that mechanism's cocked across. That latches into place. Okay, so now the shutter's in the cocked position. What it does, it removes the cam here from contact with this arm on the retard gear train. And that allows me to see this screw here, which I need to remove so we can remove the retard gear train from the shutter. This screw goes through a fairly large hole in the retard gear train. These screws are quite tight, and that allows you some adjustment. It means that you can adjust your speeds. Effectively, this point becomes the pivot point, but you can swing this arm in towards the centre for greater engagement with the cam, or outwards for lesser engagement with the cam, and that's how you can adjust your speeds. Right, we can remove this from the shutter. Now, the retard gear train should move quite smoothly. Let's see if that's very, very stiff, which tells me that that's some of our problem with the speeds. In fact, that's reluctant to move at all. Oh, it's moving now. Once I took the cam off the end, it moved. But that's certainly not right. That needs to be cleaned. That's part of our problem with the speeds. Now, as you remove these pieces from the shutter, you need to take note of which screws came from where and see that they go back in the correct places. What else can we get into at the shutter here? This here is our self-timer. When that's set, as the cocking ring comes back, when you release the shutter, it acts on this lever, which releases this the action of this self-timer, or delay action. Now that, as you can see, that's also very sticky. It's very reluctant to move. Now, I hadn't tested the self-timer before on the shutter because there was really no point. We knew the shutter was not working especially well, and the chances were fairly high that the self-timer would not function. And with self-timers that don't function, you can end up with a crippled camera if you set them when you've got no need to, and they don't run down. Right, so what else from the front? Well, here's our main drive spring. You can unhook that. I'm looking at the state of that. You've got one side of the coil, you can see it's got an arm that's sticking up here at about the 12 o'clock position. Well, the other side of the coil here has got a little nub that sticks up. And if that's at the 12, you'd say that nub was at about 3:15. that's a fairly relaxed position. Basically it means that that spring has got tired and it's not returning to its original rest position. In the original rest position, this little nub would have been at about the 2 o'clock position. And that means that spring's tired, and in the normal course of events, in the old days, when you could buy new parts off the shelf, that spring would have been replaced as a matter of course when a shutter was being serviced. So with that out the way, let's take the main cam off. And we can take the shutter release arm out here, I think. It has a return spring that's tucked down inside the edge of the case here. And for reasons best known to itself, it's reluctant to come out today. Here we go. This is the little mechanism that controls the flash sync, and it also acts to latch the shutter in the cocked position. 2 screws. Let's just move this into the cocked position so you can see things. There's a little spring acting on this arm. This spring is here. I'm going to unhook that. Any spring, you want to remove the tension from them before you go to remove the screw, otherwise the spring is under tension and you remove the screw holding it in position, there's a very high likelihood it'll disappear. It'll take off to the boundary somewhere. You'll never find the thing again. There's the screw that it goes around. That's got a collar around it. It's a shoulder screw. And here is the spring. I'll stick it there on the shutter so you can see it. Easily lost. I'm going to take care not to lose little things like that, because any part that's easily lost on a camera is likely to have been lost on thousands of cameras, and as a result anybody's spare parts are likely to have long since been used up replacing those pieces. Right, so we take those screws out and lift that arm off the top. Here's our moving flash contact. Remove this little lever. That's part of that flash sync cocking mechanism. Sometimes it's a bit reluctant to lift up. Now there we have it. This spring, that's fairly firm. I'll need a pair of pliers on that to grab it, I think. I've got a pair here. I just want to stretch that out and unhook it. Now you're unhooking it from this hole in the arm at this point. What often happens is as you stretch the spring out, instead of it lifting out of the hole easily, you find that the arm just travels away with you. So you're just stretching it out further and further and not unhooking it. Well, in that case, you'll end up stressing the spring and breaking it. So what I do here is I'll put a screwdriver behind the back of that arm so it can't move back, and then I'll stretch the spring out just a little bit, which is all I need to do to unhook the spring. And so the spring was not stressed, and it's unhooked. This little arm should come off. This little wheel will come off. That's the pallet wheel for the flash sync. Now the flash sync mechanism there is used to delay the opening of the shutter after you press the shutter release to allow the flash to, it makes the flash contacts before the shutter opens. or at the first stage of the shutter opening. That's to allow the flash bulbs to burn at peak brilliance before the blades open and close again to make the exposure. And if you didn't have that, the only way you can get good flash results is by running a very slow shutter speed to ensure that the shutter will be open at the time of useful illumination. Electronic flash didn't really have that problem. Electronic flash was, for practical purposes, instantaneous, and that was set to make the contact at the point the shutter blades were fully open. But for bulbs, you wanted to be able to fire the flash before the shutter blades got to that point. Now there's a little spring right here on this arm, and that is very keen to get away, so I'm holding a toothpick over the centre of that, and I'll unhook it from this arm, release the tension, and very carefully pick that spring up. And it's pretty small, I don't know whether you'll see it at all. It's just a very, very fine spring, and it's keen to get away. Don't let it. Anything else we can remove from the front? Oh yes, I think so. We can take this arm off. That's the B lever there. Its job is to hold the blade actuating ring when the blades are in the fully open position until you release your finger from the shutter release, in which case this pulls back out of the way and the blade actuating ring can continue its progress and close the shutter blades. Of course, that's only when you've got the shutter set to B. So there's that spring. This is another one that it can go for it can try to jump out too, so you've got to be careful with that. That usually just stays trapped on that spring head, that screw head. There's another spring in here yet too. I'm going to remove the B lever, and there's a little wee spring here. I'm just unhooking it. It goes around that shaft, and that little tiny spring there, that actuates the B lever. It's another spring you've got to watch for. You don't want it getting away. And really, that's as much of the shutter as you can dismantle from the front. We need to get in deeper, of course, because I've got to take those shutter blades out and clean them. The diaphragm blades are quite sticky with oil, and I can tell that. See if I get this shutter blades open. If I swing this, you can see the diaphragm blades swing in and out, and you can see where they overlap, that bright shiny parts. That's oil on those blades. Now that's sticky, and if it gets too sticky, basically what happens is that the blades stick together, so that when you push this lever across, instead of the blades just neatly following the action, they will do something else. In really bad circumstances, they'll stay completely stuck, and the rivets on the back of them that form the pivot points, one of them might shear off, or otherwise it'll just jump out of the track that it runs in. I'll show you more of that when we've got this apart. But this now brings us to the point where we have to remove the shutter from the camera. To remove the shutter from a camera like this is the Retina IIIc, you need a special tool really to get at it. I'll just close the shutter so you can see better down inside here. This is the rear lens group. Now the retaining ring is down around that gap. Well, obviously to get a tool down in there, and that's quite deep, that's probably about 5mm or 6mm deep down there, you would need a tube-shaped tool to get down there to reach the notches where you can engage the tool. And the tool that's used to do the job is something like this. Now you can see that it's tubular. It will fit over that rear lens group. It's narrow enough that it'll go down between the lens group and the body. It's flattened off at the sides. That's so that it'll pass down through this film gate. and it has two tiny projections which will engage with the retaining ring that holds the shutter into the body. Now this one was given to me by another retina repair bloke. One of his friends turned him up one and he asked if I'd like one too, and I said yes please, because my one, I'm no machinist, my one was as rough as guts. It did the job, but it was made out of some very mild steel. The little points here suffered as a result, and it was no thing of beauty. But this is the sort of tool that you need to remove things from the camera. There used to be one commercially available from an outfit called Beljan, but Beljan no longer makes them. Occasionally you'll see one turn up on eBay if you're very lucky, and you need to pounce on them when they do. I'll put a link at the bottom of the video in the comments or in the description to my website, and there you'll be able to find the dimensions of the retaining rings and the important dimensions of the tool so that you could make something like that. So I'll open up the camera again, fit the tool in there carefully, rotate it until it engages with the notches on the retaining ring. Here I'm using a screwdriver on the tool to give me plenty of leverage, and I'll just break that free. I should be able to do that with my fingers from here on in. Is that it? Yes, okay. So our retaining ring, I'll just fish that out of the body. As you can see, it's quite narrow, it's quite a thin retaining ring. It's broad through this section. We have two notches to engage the tool, and it's slightly larger diameter at the bottom edge where it goes against the camera body. But here's the shutter out of the body. Now, there are usually, or more usually than not, there are shims here between the camera, the shutter and the camera body. I've got a metal shim here and a paper shim here. Now the paper shims, they're quite delicate, so be very careful at getting those off. You can also see that it's very, very oily. There's lots of oil floating around here. Now those shims are used to match a shutter and lens assembly to a camera body. It meant that in the manufacture of the camera body would have been assembled, the rangefinder would have been adjusted so that it was correct at the infinity position of the lever. That meant that there could potentially be some slight discrepancy in the actual position of the shutter from camera to camera. Likewise, the lens and shutter assemblies, in theory they're all identical, but in practice there might be slight differences between them, as anything mechanical has tolerances. And if an article's at one end of its tolerance range and the article it matches or mates against is at the other end of its tolerance range, you could end up with slight mismatches. Those mismatches are compensated for by using shims, so that when the camera body is set to its infinity position and the rangefinder and things are all working as expected, that your image from the shutter from the lens will be focused correctly on the film plane, because the choice of spaces was such that the shutter was positioned where it needed to be in order to do that. So that's that part. What else do we need to do here? We can remove the rear group. Now the rear group is usually only finger tight, and it is in this case. You don't normally need to use a tool to remove that. Sometimes you will. That's just life as we know it. and you'd want a tool that would engage with the two notches in there. And here's our shutter body. You can see the diaphragm there, and you can probably see it's a little bit oily looking. This, I can tell by the feel of this, it moves nice and smoothly and reluctantly. There's a lot of drag on that, and that is almost certainly all down to that oil that's visible on the blades. So here I've moved the shutter up onto my all-purpose block of wood, and I'm going to remove the outer shell from the shutter. That contains the curved cocking rack and so forth. From the side is a tiny screw visible here, and that compresses the little flash contact in here, or the insulator, to basically make the connection between the flash wire and the shutter itself. So I'll just back that off half a turn. It doesn't need much. There are 3 screws. This one, the head on that screw serves to locate the shutter in the camera body, and it couples with this point here on that front ring. It stops the shutter from turning loosely in the body. There are 2 other screws here. They're both small. They're different diameters. I don't remember exactly what that size was. It might be 1.2, but that one might be 1.4. They're different diameters, they're not interchangeable. When you come to put it back together, the smaller diameter screw is going to go there, the larger diameter screw is going to go there. Right, so I'll slide this off. Here we have the curved rack that's driven by the shaft coming through from the camera body, and that serves to cock the shutter. And this is just a pusher. This is the curved piece that the rack pushes, and in turn that piece pushes on that curved cocking ring here. So there's just the outer body free. It's not much controversial about these. Occasionally you'll strike damaged ones, but if you do, you're probably looking for parts cameras after that. So from the back of the camera, what's our way in? Well, there's 3 screws here hold the aperture setting lever in place. So we'll remove those. They've got quite broad heads on them. The heads are quite thin, and the thread of the screw is quite small too. Those 3 screws are identical. I'm putting these down. If I was somewhat nervous, I'll be putting these down very carefully on a piece of paper, probably marked to where they came from, but in practice I know where everything goes, and I'll just throw everything in a big tin. Right, so here we have our settings lever, and here's a shim that goes behind it. Now this is very greasy. You can see that the setting ring here is very greasy. Now a lot of our problem with the stickiness is quite likely here and not in the blades at all. You can see that there's a lot of grease on here. Now this ring here I'm pulling off now, that's the setting lever for our flash sync speed and the self timer. Now we're down to the shutter case. I'll pull those shutter blades back into the closed position. That was very stiff. Moving the lever when the shutter's stripped down this far, that should just move that shutter, open that and close it quite easily. Now that requires a notable amount of force, so I know that things are not good in there. It's probably not just oil on the blades, there's probably some sticky grease behind the setting ring here, the blade actuating ring. So taking this apart, Let's be into it. 3 screws at the back of the case. These screws are identical, and in this case they're very, very tight. That could mean anything. Could mean that they haven't been disturbed since the day the camera was built. Could mean someone serviced the shutter previously and they were somewhat heavy-handed. We'll never know. I'll lift off the case. Now we have the 2 halves of the shutter. We've got the mechanism plate here. You can see the shutter blades sitting in their positions. And we have the shutter case with the diaphragm blades visible there. So we'll like to take this apart first. 3 screws. And that plate comes off. I'm just looking at the state of that. You can see by the colour change as I move that round in the light that there's an oily sheen to that. It doesn't look that bad in reality. You can also see a big fingerprint here. That's embossed into the metal. That just means that someone picked it up between thumb and forefinger and their perspiration has just left that mark there. You can see a patch here. Shiny patch on that corner, that's definitely oil, and that means that oil and grease has found its way in or found its way around. Let's tip this lot out. Okay, so here's our case. This is the lever or the ring that actuates those diaphragm blades, and you can see again by the colour changes that oily sheen. That's oily. It shouldn't be like that. That has little grooves on the back of it that couple to the diaphragm blades here. It couples to those little rivets. So as that thing turns, it swings this thing around. So this has rivets on both sides. One acts as the pivot and the other one follows that track. You've got 5 diaphragm blades. These are all very oily. So the shutter had multiple problems there. Here's the mechanism plate. We've got 5 blades. Now the blades are put on in a certain order and a certain direction. And we can see here, where's the first blade. The first blade that you'd put on is in this position. That would be blade 2, blade 3, blade 4 and blade 5, which is on the top. The blades are all identical. Normally when you're putting the shutter back together, you've got to start with this in the open position, which it's not at the moment. These blades, I'm looking at them, I can see marks on those blades, particularly at towards the leading edge there where the blades overlap. Now that's some of that might be scuff marks, some of it's oil. This piece here, that was the oily spot that we could see before we took the shutter apart. It's got an odd look to it, and there's the matching spot where it was sitting over. So the mechanism plate, we've got the blades off it. We need to take this down a bit further. This piece here is the lens tube. The lens tube is held in place with 3 screws. One of the screws is longer than its mates because it also holds this little bracket down. Now that bracket holds the main drive spring in position. I'm just wriggling that off its post. It's normally a bit easier than that. That's the bracket that holds the main drive spring. Get these other 2 screws out. It's always a challenge dealing with tiny screws like this. Applying enough force that you can actually loosen them, keeping enough downward pressure down on your screwdriver so that the screwdriver doesn't cam out and make a mess. It's always a challenge. So here's the lens tube, and this is the blade actuating ring. It's got a spring bearing against it here. We can unhook that. That's a detent, that spring. It just acts to sort of bias the blade actuating ring into the fully open or fully closed position. And this is, it's got a little bit of graphite grease on it. It's possibly a bit much and it might have picked up a bit of dust. And here's the mechanism plate. There's the catch that holds the blade actuating ring in the cocked position. This is the piece that would act to block the movement of the blade actuating ring on the B position. This is the little pallets for the speed, flash sync speed control. And that is it. That's the shutter completely stripped down. So there we have it. That's the shutter, all in pieces and ready to be serviced. Easy.